Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 30th of September 2019 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now the first article appears on page number 10 as a lead article. The title of the article is Strictures in the Name of Security. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of GS Paper 3, Security under the subsection Linkages between development and spread of extremism as well as role of external state and non-state actors in creating challenges to internal security. Now before analyzing this particular article, let us first look into its background. On August 5, 2019, the Government of India decided to revoke the special status given to the state of J&K under Article 370 and Article 35A. The government was of the opinion that these special provisions had hindered the economic, political and psychological integration of the state of J&K into the Indian Union. The government also felt that these special provisions had led to a vicious cycle of underdevelopment and extremism in the state of J&K. As to how these special provisions led to the vicious cycle of underdevelopment and extremism, you can simply look at this particular flowchart. Now, as per these special provisions, the union laws were not directly applicable to the state of J&K. It allowed only the citizens of J&K to buy property in the state. Moreover, the control of the central government over the state of J&K was comparatively lower as compared to the Indian states. Hence, such provisions in turn hindered the growth of trade, commerce and investment in the region of Jammu and Kashmir. It has also hindered the development of tourism sector, which could have well emerged as a tool of development for the state of J&K. So this particular underdevelopment in J&K has led to lack of employment opportunities for the Kashmiri youths, leading to a case of disenchantment among the Kashmiri youths. So this particular feeling of political, economic and psychological isolation among the Kashmiri youths was in turn taken advantage by the separatists in Jammu and Kashmir as well as our neighboring country Pakistan in order to fuel the insurgency, separatism as well as extremism. Pakistan used to train a large number of terrorists in the POK region and infiltrate those people into J&K so as to create the security turmoil. A large number of Kashmiri youths used to involved in the stone pelting against the Indian armed forces who were stationed in the state to control the security situation. Hence, the special provisions, instead of ensuring the political and economic integration, has led to a vicious cycle of underdevelopment, extremism, separatism and insurgency in J&K. Now, the Government of India has asserted that the revocation of these special privileges would put an end to this particular vicious cycle and would lead to an improvement in the security situation in the region. In this regard, this particular lead article here argues that this particular assertion of the government needs to be questioned, wherein the author believes that the recent government action of revoking the special status followed by the communication lockdown may actually end up aggravating the present volatile security situation prevailing in the region. Now, before discussing various aspects of this particular article, I want to categorically state that these viewpoints are purely from the perspective of the author. We are merely highlighting as to what the author is actually saying. Now, as stated before, this particular lead article here provides a set of criticisms against the government action of revoking the special status enjoyed by the state of J&K. It also provides a set of criticisms against the communication clampdown imposed by the Government of India subsequent to the revocation. Now, the first set of criticism is with respect to the flawed government's argument. Now, the Government of India has revoked the special status of the state of J&K on the grounds that the security situation in the region was growing volatile in the recent times, and this needed the Government of India to take certain radical and drastic measures to end the separatism and violence in the region. However, the author of this particular article here believes that this particular government's argument is flawed mainly on two grounds. First and foremost, the author of this particular article believes that the security situation in the state had improved in this particular year, which is evident in the decrease in the number of the terror violences. For example, the number of casualties during the first 9 months of this particular year had declined to around 237 as compared to around 2,600 casualties in the year 1995. Further, the government of India has also stated that there is a need for the communication lockdown in the valley because of a planned attack. However, the government of India has not been able to present any kind of concrete and verifiable evidence of any kind of planned attack. Further, the author of this particular article also argues that this recent decision of the government has caused a widespread resentment among the Kashmiris, and hence the clampdown on the communication lines has been imposed mainly in the anticipation of the large-scale protest by the Kashmiris against the government's decision. The author of this particular article also argues that the recent communication clampdown imposed by the government can actually aggravate the present security situation prevailing in the region. First and foremost, with respect to this particular point, the government of India would not be able to put a clampdown on the communication lines indefinitely. One or the other day in future, the government may be required to lift these restrictions. So the question which arises here is that what will happen once the communication lines are restored? Will the prevailing peace and non-violence in the region continue, or will it lead to the increase in the protest movements and violences once the communication lines are restored? Now, the author argues that there has been a growing resentment among the Kashmiris against the government's decision, and this resentment as such may lead to the vicious cycle of underdevelopment and extremism in future once the communication lines are restored. More importantly, such kind of resentment among the Kashmiris would be in turn tapped by the separatist elements as well as Pakistan in future. Hence, a government action of clamping down on the communication line can lead to a higher support for the separatist elements in this particular region. Secondly, from the last decade onwards, the amount of support which was enjoyed by the terrorist infiltrators trained and supported by Pakistan had reduced considerably. However, going forward, the author of this particular article argues that this particular trend could see a reversal wherein these terror elements may enjoy a higher amount of support among the local population. And more importantly, Pakistan may take advantage of the present security situation in the region. The next aspect is related to the support enjoyed by the Indian Armed Forces. Now, the improvement in the security situation in the recent past had enabled the Indian Armed Forces to earn certain amount of goodwill among the local population. Now, certain sections of the Kashmiri society used to support the Indian Armed Forces to maintain the security situation by acting as informers or in any other capacities. However, the recent government action has led to erosion of whatever trust and credibility which the Indian Armed Forces had enjoyed. Now, going forward, the Indian Armed Forces cannot rely on the local communities to clamp down on the terror elements. Nextly, the author also argues that the clampdown on the communication lines would also make it difficult for the armed forces to collect the intelligence related to the terror elements operating in the region. And lastly, the author also argues that the recent decision of the government poses a huge amount of economic threat to the Indian economy. So the government of India has stated that the revocation of Article 370 would be a game changer and bring about the economic development of the Kashmir region. But what has happened since the revocation of these special privileges and the communication clampdown? The Kashmiri industries have lost crores of rupees. Apart from that, the government of India has spent huge amount of money in maintaining around 40,000 additional troops in this particular region. And this will undoubtedly cost the Indian taxpayers a huge amount of money. But the question which has to be asked here is, in spite of the huge amount of money which is being spent here, would it lead to the improvement in the security situation? Now, the author argues that the additional expenses incurred by the government may not be able to appease the Kashmiris, and hence such expenditure may not lead to improvement in the security situation in the region. Hence, in this regard, the author argues that in the name of the security threat, the government of India has undermined the fundamental rights of the people living in this particular region. The government has detained a large number of people under the preventive detention. It has banned dissent in the region. It has blocked mobile, internet, and the telephone lines in the region, leading to the violation of the fundamental rights of the people. Apart from that, if you look at the other countries such as US or for that matter, even European Union, even these countries clamp down on the fundamental rights of the people in the name of the internal security. However, when these countries impose the clampdown on the communication lines on the names of the internal security, usually such kind of clampdown lasts only for days and not weeks. However, if you look at the present Kashmir issue, the present clampdown on the communication lines has been in operation for more than around 7 to 8 weeks. And accordingly, such clampdown on the communication lines go against the democratic ethos and the constitutional values of a democratic country like India. Hence, in this regard, the author of this particular article argues for lifting the present curbs on the communication lines at the earliest and to restore the rights back to the people. Now, based upon our video analysis, a main question for your practice here could be the special privileges enjoyed by Jammu and Kashmir under Article 370 and Article 35A had led to a vicious cycle of underdevelopment and extremism. In this regard, do you think the recent action of the revocation of the special privileges would lead to the improvement in the security situation? Discuss. Now you can try writing answer to this particular question based upon our video analysis. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 1. The title of the article is Election Commission Cut Short the Disqualification Term of the Sikkim CM Tamang. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of GS Paper 2, Governance, under the subsection Salient Features of the Representation of People's Act. Apart from that, this particular article is also important because a rated question has been asked in UPSC Mains 2019, where the question was, on what grounds a people's representative can be disqualified under the Representation of People's Act 1951. Also mention the remedies available to such person against the disqualification. Article 324 to Article 329 of the Indian Constitution deal with the conduct of elections. The Constitution allows the Parliament to make the provisions in all the matters relating to the elections to the Parliament and the state legislatures. In exercise of this particular power, the Parliament of India has enacted the Representation of People's Act 1950 as well as the Representation of People's Act 1951. The Representation of People's Act 1950 deals with the qualification of voters, the preparation of the electoral rolls, the delimitation of the constituencies and the allocation of seats in the Parliament as well as the state legislatures. Whereas the Representation of People's Act 1951 deal with the actual conduct of elections, wherein it provides for the qualification and disqualification of members of both the houses of Parliament, that is both Lok Sabha as well as Rajya Sabha, as well as the state legislatures, that is the State Legislative Assembly and the State Legislative Council. Now this particular act is of special significance to the smooth functioning of the Indian democracy, since it checks the entry of persons with a criminal background into the representative bodies. Now some of the important provisions of the Representation of People's Act 1951 which you need to know in order to understand this particular article are, first and foremost, the section 8 clause 1 of the Representation of People's Act 1951. Now under this particular section, a person who is convicted of offences under this particular act can be barred from contesting elections for a period of 6 years after his release. Now for example, if a person convicted under this particular act is released in the year 2018, then he will not be able to contest elections at least until the end of 2024, that is for a period of 6 years. Apart from that, the section 123 of the Representation of People's Act also provides a list of corrupt practices under which a person can be convicted under this particular act. And some of the corrupt practices included under this particular act include bribery, undue influence, appeal by the candidate on the grounds of religion, race, caste, community or language, use of national symbols such as national flag, national emblem for campaigning in the elections, promotion of enmity or hatred between the different classes of the Indian citizens, propagation of sati or its glorification, and the corrupt practice can also include getting assistance from the gazetted officer in order to enhance the prospect of winning the elections. And the third section which is important from this particular article is the section 11. Under this particular section, the Election Commission of India has been empowered to remove the disqualification or reduce the term of disqualification of the members who are convicted under the Representation of People's Act. Now, for example, if a particular member has been convicted under this particular act and if he is barred from contesting elections for a period of 6 years, then the Election Commission of India can reduce the term of his disqualification to say around 1 year, which means to say a person will be able to contest elections 1 year after his release. However, the Election Commission of India cannot take such decisions arbitrarily. It has to substantiate its decision in writing, wherein it is required to state as to why it has decided to reduce the duration of the disqualification. Let us now understand this particular article through a timeline. In the year 1997, Prem Singh Tamang, who is presently the Chief Minister of Sikkim, was then the Animal Husbandry Minister in the Sikkim government. He was involved in a corruption case in a cow distribution scheme. Subsequently, in the year 2017, he was given a jail term of 1 year for the involvement in the corruption, and this was done in pursuance of Section 8, Clause 1 of the Representation of the People's Act. And after completing his jail term, he was released in August 2018. And as discussed before, under Section 8, Clause 1 of the Representation of People's Act 1951, a person who is convicted is not allowed to contest elections for a period of 6 years. So since Prem Singh Tamang was released in August 2018, he was not allowed to contest elections until at least 2024. Now, even though Prem Singh Tamang was disqualified from contesting elections for a period of 6 years, in May 2019, he was appointed as the Chief Minister of Sikkim. Now the question here is, how come he was appointed as the Chief Minister of Sikkim even when he was disqualified from being a member of the state legislature? Now this can be understood by looking at Article 164 Clause 4 of the Indian Constitution. Under this particular article, a person can be appointed as a minister without being the member of the state legislature. However, such a person has to get elected to the state legislature within the next 6 months, failing which such a person cannot continue being a minister. Now in case of Prem Singh Tamang, he was released in August 2018 and was barred from contesting elections for the next 6 years. That is, he was not allowed to contest elections until 2024. Hence, questions were raised as to how Prem Singh Tamang would get elected to the state legislature within the next 6 months. Now, this particular article here has highlighted that the Election Commission of India has recently reduced the disqualification term of Prem Singh Tamang from 6 years to just around 1 year and 1 month. Which means to say, since Prem Singh Tamang was released in August 2018, he would be qualified to contest elections from the September 2019 onwards. Now, this particular decision of the Election Commission raises certain pertinent questions related to the appointment of the disqualified members as the Chief Minister. Now, this is because in the year 2001, Jayalalitha was implicated in a corruption case. Now, in spite of her conviction, she was sworn in as a Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu in the year 2001. Subsequently, the Constitutional Bench of the Supreme Court held that a person who is disqualified from contesting elections cannot be appointed as the Chief Minister of a state. Further, the Supreme Court of India had also stated that Article 164 Clause 4 of the Indian Constitution would not be applicable for the appointment of the disqualified persons as the Chief Minister of a state. Now, if you apply this particular precedent set by the Supreme Court in the Jayalalitha case, even the appointment of Prem Singh Tamang as the Chief Minister of Sikkim can be considered as unconstitutional. However, the Election Commission of India has refused to comment on the legality of appointment of P.S. Tamang as the Chief Minister of Sikkim. It has only reduced the disqualification term of P.S. Tamang from 6 years to 1 year and 1 month. So with respect to this particular article, a very pertinent question which arises here is that whether a person who is convicted under the Representation of People's Act, can he take a recourse to Article 164 Clause 4 and be appointed as the Chief Minister of a state? It is to be noted that this particular case is presently before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is yet to decide on the constitutionality of the appointment of P.S. Tamang as the Chief Minister of Sikkim. So let us wait and watch as to what would be the judgment of Supreme Court with respect to appointment of Prem Singh Tamang as the Chief Minister of Sikkim. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 11. The title of the article is Two Asian Powers and an Island. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of GS Paper 2, International Relations, under the subsection India and its Neighbourhood. Now before analysing this particular article, let us first look into its background. The Government of India had unveiled the Neighbourhood First policy so as to strengthen and deepen the bilateral relationship with India's immediate neighbours in the South Asian region. As part of this particular policy, the Government of India sought to strengthen the political, economic and cultural cooperation on a sustained basis with its immediate neighbours. However, one of the major constraints before the India's Neighbourhood First policy is the growing influence of China in India's neighbourhood. Now, in the recent past, China has been able to substantially increase its influence in India's neighbourhood, including the Indian Ocean region. It has substantially increased its investment in the neighbouring countries such as Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh and so on. It has come out with a Belt and Road initiative so as to promote the greater economic and political integration of these countries into China. It has also built a number of ports in the Indian Ocean region such as the Gwadar port in Pakistan, Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, Chittagong port in Bangladesh and so on. So both India as well as China have sought to enhance their political and economic integration with the countries in the Indian Ocean region. In this regard, this particular article here discusses as to how India and China have engaged with Sri Lanka in the last 4 years. Now why this becomes important is because in the year 2015, Maithripal Sirisena became the president of Sri Lanka, and this was a time when there was a strong anti-China mood in Sri Lanka because of the various Chinese projects such as the Hambantota port. Now what has happened in the last 4 years is that China has been able to substantially increase its influence in Sri Lanka in spite of the strong anti-China sentiments prevailing in Sri Lanka. On the other hand, India as such has failed to capitalize on the anti-China sentiment. In this regard, this particular article here focuses on 3 distinct aspects. First and foremost, it highlights as to how China has substantially increased its relationship with Sri Lanka in spite of the strong anti-China sentiment. Secondly, it highlights as to why India has failed to capitalize on the anti-China sentiment prevailing in Sri Lanka. And thirdly, Sri Lanka is set to elect a new president after 2 months. Hence, this article here argues that India needs to engage with the new government in Sri Lanka in a constructive manner and remove all the bottlenecks that have hindered the development of a full-fledged and meaningful relationship between India and Sri Lanka. So let us start analysing these aspects of the article one by one. Let us first understand as to how China has successfully enhanced its relationship with Sri Lanka. Now, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative has come under immense criticism since it drives the countries into a debt trap. Now, some of the countries have taken huge amount of loans from China to build various kind of infrastructure projects in their country. It has been alleged that some of these infrastructure projects are financially unviable and hence the member countries of the Belt and Road Initiative would not be in a position to repay back the loans. Now, one classical case of such a debt trap is the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, wherein Sri Lanka had borrowed huge amount of money from China so as to build the Hambantota port. However, since it was not in a position to repay back the loan, it had to hand over the management of the Hambantota port to a Chinese company on a lease for almost around 99 years. So there was a strong anti-China sentiment in Sri Lanka due to the debt trap created by the Hambantota port. Further, this particular sentiment was worsened due to the handover of the strategic ports such as Hambantota to a Chinese company. However, what has happened is that in the last 4 years, China has been able to reverse these initial setbacks. China has been able to resolve all the controversies related to the Chinese projects in Sri Lanka, and accordingly, there has been increase in the number of Chinese projects in Sri Lanka in the last 4 years. For example, China is presently building the Colombo Port City project, and upon the completion of this particular project, it would serve as a major transshipment hub for India. Apart from that, China has recently built the multifunctional telecommunication tower known as Lotus Tower in Colombo. The trade relationship between Sri Lanka and China has also strengthened in the last 4 years. For example, the overall Chinese imports into Sri Lanka presently accounts for almost around 18.5%. In contrast, the overall Indian imports into Sri Lanka is around 19%. So the overall trade relationship between China and Sri Lanka is almost on par with the trade relationship between Sri Lanka and India. Now, as discussed before, at the start of 2015, there was huge anti-China sentiment in Sri Lanka, mainly because of the debt trap created by the Chinese projects. And ideally, India should have capitalized on this anti-China sentiment so as to deepen its relationship with Sri Lanka. However, this particular article here highlights that India has failed to capitalize on this particular opportunity, and this is mainly on account of the undue delays in the execution of various infrastructure projects by India. For example, some of the Indian projects such as the renovation of the Kankesutre port in northern province of Sri Lanka as well as the development of Pale airport in Sri Lanka have made little progress in the last 4 years. Apart from that, India and Sri Lanka presently have a free trade agreement in place, and both the countries had decided to widen the ambit of free trade agreement into the economic and technical cooperation. However, there has been lack of progress on the signing of the economic and technical cooperation between the two countries. Now, apart from these setbacks, there are certain positives of India's engagement with Sri Lanka in the last 4 years. For example, India has signed a joint venture deal with Japan and Sri Lanka for the development of the East Container Terminal at the Colombo port. The construction of social infrastructure projects such as the construction of homes for the displaced Sri Lankan Tamils has gained momentum in the last 4 years. Now, in spite of these positives, the article here argues that India must not remain satisfied with such a modest track record and it should enhance its investment in Sri Lanka. And accordingly, it has set an agenda for the Indian government to engage with the new Sri Lankan government once it comes into power, wherein the article highlights that the relationship between India and Sri Lanka are much more deeper and complex as compared to the China-Sri Lanka relationship. India has always been the first country to respond to any kind of crisis in Sri Lanka. For example, India was the first country to offer assistance to Sri Lanka after the 2004 tsunami. Similarly, India was the first country to condemn terrorism in Sri Lanka after the Easter Sunday attacks. Hence, going forward, India needs to build on the age-old civilizational ties with Sri Lanka and impart a greater amount of trust to the Indo-Sri Lanka relationship. Now, as to how should Indian government engage with the new Sri Lankan government, the article here has highlighted that India should aid in the development of the northern and eastern provinces of Sri Lanka. It is to be noted that both northern and eastern provinces of Sri Lanka are basically dominated by the Sri Lankan Tamils, and they have remained comparatively underdeveloped as compared to the other parts of Sri Lanka. And hence, India should focus upon both political development as well as the economic development of these provinces. Now, with respect to political development, Indian government should keep on engaging with the Sri Lankan government for devolution of greater amount of powers to the Sri Lankan Tamils in the northern and eastern provinces. Similarly, India should provide for the higher amount of financial assistance for the economic development of these two provinces. Secondly, since a large number of infrastructure projects have got delayed, India must focus upon getting the expeditious approval for the pending infrastructure projects. And lastly, presently around 95,000 Sri Lankan Tamils are living in the state of Tamil Nadu. Now, these Sri Lankan Tamils had got displaced during the LTT war. In this regard, this particular article here highlights that the Indian government should take up the voluntary repatriation of these Sri Lankan Tamils from the Tamil Nadu. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 9. The title of the article is Obesity and Undernutrition Coexist, finds a study. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of GS Paper 2, Governance, under the subsection Issues relating to development and management of health. According to World Health Organization, the malnutrition refers to the deficiencies, excess or imbalance in person's intake of energy or the nutrients. The term malnutrition involves three broad conditions. The first condition is being the undernutrition, which may involve wasting, which refers to the low weight for the weight, stunting, which stands for the low height for the age, underweight, which stands for low weight for the age. The second condition refers to the micronutrient malnutrition, which can be both micronutrition deficiencies or the excess of the micronutrients. The third dimension involves the obesity, which may involve both overweight conditions as well as the diet-related non-communicable diseases such as the heart-related diseases, stroke, diabetes, and some form of cancers. Now, every country in the world is affected by one or more forms of malnutrition. Combating malnutrition in all its forms is one of the greatest global health challenges. Now, if you look at the linkages between poverty and malnutrition, the poverty amplifies the risk of the malnutrition. Now, people who are considered to be poor are more likely to be affected by the different forms of malnutrition. Also, malnutrition increases the healthcare cost, reduces the productivity, and slows the economic growth, and this can in turn perpetuate a vicious cycle of poverty and malnutrition. Hence, in order to address the problem of malnutrition, on April 1st, 2016, the United Nations General Assembly has proclaimed 2016 to 2025 as the United Nations Decade of Action on Nutrition. Now, this particular article here is based upon the first ever National Nutrition Survey, which is conducted by the central government in association with UNICEF. Now, this particular survey seeks to measure malnutrition through the biochemical measures such as the urine and blood samples, through the anthropometric data such as the height and weight of the children, as well as the prevalence of the non-communicable diseases among the adolescents. Now, as per this particular report, we have a direct evidence about the coexistence of obesity and undernutrition among the school-going children in India. Now, some of the highlights of this particular report as published in this particular newspaper article are, this particular article highlights that there has been increase in the cases of the pre-diabetes among the school-going children as well as the adolescents. Further, almost around 20% of the children in the age group 5 to 9 are stunted, which means to say their height as such is considered to be quite lower as compared to their age. Further, 25% of the children are wasted, which means to say the weight of the children as such is lower as compared to their height. Almost around 4% of the adolescents have a high level of cholesterol, and almost around 7% of the children have a risk of the chronic kidney disease. And please note that the National Nutrition Survey report has not been published so far. So as and when this particular report is published, we shall discuss all the aspects related to the National Nutrition Survey. Apart from that, this particular definition of malnutrition given by the World Health Organization becomes important, because if you ever come across any question related to malnutrition in the UPSC mains, please do not take a narrow viewpoint of malnutrition as undernutrition. Malnutrition also encompasses obesity as well as the overweight. Hence, whenever you are writing an answer in the UPSC mains, you must take into account the second aspect of obesity as well as the overweight. Now, the next article appears on page number 1. The title of the article is "A Week After the High-Profile Memorandum of Understanding, Questions Cloud the Petronet Tellurian Deal." This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of GS Paper 2, International Relations, under the subsection Bilateral Agreements Involving India or Affecting India's Interest. Now, during the recent visit of Prime Minister Modi to USA, a Memorandum of Understanding was signed between India's LNG importer Petronet and a US-based company known as Tellurian. As part of this Memorandum of Understanding, Petronet decided to invest around $2.5 billion in the American LNG company Tellurian, and accordingly, Petronet would get a supply of around 5 million tons of natural gas from USA. In this regard, this particular article here raises certain problems with respect to the recent MOU signed between Petronet and Tellurian, wherein this particular article highlights that this particular deal between Petronet and Tellurian could possibly lead to a demand-supply mismatch in the Indian economy. Now, this is primarily because if you look at the overall demand for the natural gas in the Indian economy, this particular demand has substantially reduced in the last few years. However, the supply of the natural gas in the Indian economy has substantially increased. Hence, the recent signing of MOU can aggravate the present demand-supply mismatch with respect to the natural gas. For instance, since the Indian economy, particularly the manufacturing sector in India, is facing the economic slowdown, and accordingly, the overall demand for the natural gas in the Indian economy has also reduced. The second concern is that even if you are able to import huge amount of natural gas, India does not have sufficient number of regasification plant for processing this natural gas. Thirdly, the article also highlights that the gas pipeline infrastructure in India has remained comparatively underdeveloped, because of which even if we import the natural gas, we would not be in a position to supply the natural gas to all the nook and corner of the country. And lastly, so far India has had a bad experience with the lock-in contracts signed by the Indian companies. Now under the lock-in contracts, the Indian companies would be required to import certain amount of natural gas as provided in the contract, and such kind of obligation on the Indian companies provided under the lock-in contract is for a long period of time, and usually such kind of lock-in contracts for a long period of time goes against the interest of Indian companies. For example, in the year 2011, the Gas Authority of India Limited had entered into a 20-year contract with the American companies to buy around 5.8 million tons of the LNG every year. However, because of the demand-supply mismatch created with respect to the imported LNG, the Gas Authority of India Limited had to sell the excess natural gas in the other markets. So going forward, this particular article here highlights that the present demand-supply mismatch with respect to natural gas can actually aggravate in future after the signing of this memorandum of understanding. Now based upon our video analysis, these 4 questions shall be a prelims question for the practice. Please pause this video and try to find answers to these 4 questions. We shall be discussing the answer after 5 seconds. The first question here is, consider the following statements related to the Representation of People's Act 1951. The first statement here is, it bars the members convicted of offences under the Act from contesting elections for a period of 6 years after the release. And as we have discussed, this particular statement here is correct. The second statement reads as, only the Supreme Court of India has been empowered to reduce the term of the disqualification of the convicted members. Now this particular option here is wrong. This is because, as we have discussed before, the Election Commission of India has been empowered to reduce the term of disqualification of the convicted members. So if you look at the options which are given here, the correct answer to this particular question is A, that is 1 only. Now coming to the second question, the question here is, which among the following international agencies publishes the Global Hunger Index report? And the answer to this particular question is the International Food Policy Research Institute. Now coming to third question, the question here is, which among the following are considered as corrupt practices under the Representation of People's Act 1951? The first option here is appeal by the candidate on the grounds of religion, race, caste, community or language. The second option reads as propagation of sati or its glorification. The third option reads as getting assistance from the gazetted officer to enhance the prospect of winning election. As we have discussed, all of these 3 options can be considered as the corrupt practices under the Representation of People's Act 1951. And accordingly, the correct answer to this particular question is D. Now coming to the last question, the question here is, consider the following statements. The first statement here is, the Prime Minister in India must compulsorily be a member of Lok Sabha and not Rajya Sabha. This particular statement here is wrong. This is because the Prime Minister in India can be a member of either the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha. The second option reads as, a person cannot be appointed as a minister without being a member of parliament. Even this particular option here is wrong. This is because a person can be appointed as minister without being a member of parliament. However, such a person has to get elected to the parliament within next 6 months. So if you look at the options which are given here, the correct answer to this particular question shall be D. That is neither 1 nor 2. With this, we have come to end of today's discussion. Now let us have a look at the question for the day.